Jigsaw puzzle. It was on the top shelf of an old bookcase, covered with dust and barely visible. Lisa decided she had to find out what it was. Of all the things in the old junk shop, it aroused her curiosity most. She had looked through old books, prints, and postcards for hours. Nothing had caught her interest. Now the old box, high and out of reach, intrigued her. She looked around for the old man who ran the store. But he had gone into the back room. She saw a stepladder across the room and brought it over to the bookcase. It shook on the uneven floorboards as she climbed to the top step. Lisa patted her hand along the surface of the top shelf, trying to find the box. The dirt was thick and gritty on the board. Then she touched the box. It was made of cardboard. The cardboard was cold and soft from being in the damp room for such a long time. She lifted the box down slowly, trying to steady her balance on the stepladder. As the side of the box reached her eye level, she could read the words, 500 pieces. She sat the box down on top of the stepladder and climbed down a few steps. Then she blew away some of the dust that had accumulated on the lid. It billowed up around her with a musty, dead odor. But now she could make out a few more words on top of the box.
The strangest jigsaw puzzle in the world.
There were other words underneath that, but they had been rubbed off the cardboard lid. The big picture on the cover had been curiously damaged. Lisa could make out areas of light and dark. It looked as though the scene might be in a room. But most of the picture had been scratched off the cardboard box, probably by a sharp instrument. The mysterious nature of the jigsaw puzzle made it even more appealing to Lisa. She decided she would buy it. The lid was taped down securely. That probably meant that all the pieces would be there. As she carefully climbed down the stepladder, holding the box in both hands, Lisa smiled to herself. It was quite a find, just the sort of thing she had always hoped to discover while rummaging through second-hand stores. Mr. Tuborg, the owner of the store, came out of the back room as she was walking up to his sales desk. He looked curiously at the box when Lisa set it down. "And where did you find that?" he asked her. Lisa pointed to where she had set up the stepladder. It was on top of that bookcase. You could barely see it from the floor. "Well, I've never seen it before, that's for sure," Mr. Tuborg said. "I can't imagine how you found it." Lisa was more pleased than ever about her find. She felt as though the puzzle had been hiding up there, waiting for her to discover it. She paid Mr. Tuborg the 25 cents he asked for the puzzle and then wrapped it carefully in the newspapers he gave her to take it home in. It was late on a Saturday afternoon. Lisa lived alone in a small room in an old apartment house. She had no plans for Saturday night. Now she decided to spend the whole evening working on the puzzle. She stopped at a delicatessen and bought some meat, bread, and cheese for sandwiches. She would eat while she put the puzzle together. As soon as she had climbed the flight of stairs to her room and put away the groceries, Lisa cleaned off the big table in the center of the room. She set the box down on it.
The strangest jigsaw puzzle in the world.
Lisa read the words again. She wondered what they could mean. How strange could a jigsaw puzzle be? The tape that held the lid down was still strong. Lisa got out a kitchen knife to slice through it. When she lifted the cover off the box, a musty smell came from inside. But the jigsaw pieces all looked in good condition. Lisa picked one up. The color was faded, but the picture was clear. She could see the shape of a finger in the piece. It looked like a woman's finger. Lisa sat down and started to lay out the pieces, top side up, on the large table. As she took them from the box, she sorted out the flat-edged pieces from the inside pieces. Every so often, she would recognize something in one of the pieces. She saw some blonde hair, a window pane, and a small vase. There was a lot of wood texture in the pieces, plus what looked like wallpaper. Lisa noticed that the wallpaper in the puzzle looked a lot like the wallpaper in her own room. She wondered if her wallpaper was as old as the jigsaw puzzle. It would be an incredible coincidence, but it could be the same. By the time Lisa had all of the pieces laid out on the table, it was 6:30. She got up and made herself a sandwich. Already, her back was beginning to hurt a little from leaning over the table. But she couldn't stay away from the puzzle. She went back to the table and set her sandwich down beside her. It was always like that when she did jigsaws. Once she started, she couldn't stop until the puzzle was all put together. She began to sort out the edge pieces according to their coloring. There were dark brown pieces, whitish pieces, the wallpaper pieces, and some pieces that seemed to be like glass, perhaps a window. As she slowly ate her sandwich, Lisa pieced together the border. When she was finished, she knew she had been right about the setting of the picture when she had first seen the puzzle. It was a room. One side of the border was wallpaper. Lisa decided to fill that in first. She was curious about its resemblance to her own wallpaper. She gathered all the pieces together that had the blue and lilac flowered design. As she fit the pieces together, it became clear that the wallpaper in the puzzle was identical to the wallpaper in her room. Lisa glanced back and forth between the puzzle and her wall. It was an exact match. By now it was 8:30. Lisa leaned back in her chair. Her back was stiff. She looked over at her window. The night was black outside. Lisa got up and walked over to the window. Suddenly, she felt uneasy, alone in the apartment. She pulled the white shade over the window. She paced around the room once, trying to think of something else she might do instead of finishing the puzzle. But nothing else interested her. She went back and sat down at the table. Next, she started to fill in the lower right-hand corner. There was a rug and then a chair. This part of the puzzle was very dark. Lisa noticed uneasily that the chair was the same shape as one sitting in the corner of her room. But the colors didn't seem exactly the same. Her chair was maroon. The one in the puzzle was in the shadows and seemed almost black. Lisa continued to fill in the border toward the middle. There was more wallpaper to finish on top. The left-hand side did turn out to be a window. Through it, a half-moon hung in a dark sky. But it was the bottom of the puzzle that began to bother Lisa. As the pieces fell into place, she saw a picture of a pair of legs, crossed underneath a table. They were the legs of a young woman. Lisa reached down and ran her hand along one of her legs. Suddenly, she had felt as though something was crawling up it, but it must have been her imagination. She stared down at the puzzle. It was almost 3/4 done. Only the middle remained. Lisa glanced at the lid of the puzzle box.
The strangest jigsaw.
She shuddered. Lisa leaned back in her chair again. Her back ached. Her neck muscles were tense and strained. She thought about quitting the puzzle. It scared her now. She stood up and stretched. Then she looked down at the puzzle on the table. It looked different from the higher angle. Lisa was shocked by what she saw. Her body began to tremble all over. It was unmistakable, the picture in the puzzle was of her own room. The window was placed correctly in relation to the table. The bookcase stood in its exact spot against the wall. Even the carved table legs were the same. Lisa raised her hand to knock the pieces of the puzzle apart. She didn't want to finish the strangest jigsaw puzzle in the world. She didn't want to find out what the hole in the middle of the puzzle might turn out to be. But then she lowered her hand. Perhaps it was worse not to know. Perhaps it was worse to wait and wonder. Lisa sank back down into the chair at the table. She fought off the fear that crept into the sore muscles of her back. Deliberately, piece by piece, she began to fill in the hole in the puzzle. She put together a picture of a table, on which lay a jigsaw puzzle. This puzzle inside the puzzle was finished. But Lisa couldn't make out what it showed. She pieced together the young woman who was sitting at the table, the young woman who was herself. As she filled in the picture, her own body slowly filled with horror and dread. It was all there in the picture, the vase filled with blue cornflowers, her red cardigan sweater, the wild look of fear on her own face. The jigsaw puzzle lay before her, finished except for two adjoining pieces. They were dark pieces, ones she hadn't been able to fit into the area of the window. Lisa looked behind her. The white blind was drawn over her window. With relief, she realized that the puzzle picture was not exactly like her room. It showed the black night behind the window and a moon shining in the sky. With trembling hands, Lisa reached for the second to last piece. She dropped it into one of the empty spaces. It seemed to be half a face, but not a human face. She reached for the last piece. She pressed it into the small hole left in the picture. The face was complete, the face in the window. It was more horrible than anything she had ever seen, or dreamed. Lisa looked at the picture of herself in the puzzle and then back to that face. Then she whirled around. The blind was no longer over her window. The night showed black through the window pane. A half moon hung low in the sky. Lisa screamed the face it was there, too. Phobia is a scary story about one man and his fear. How about you? What scares you? Write the comment. Many people have a phobia, an unnatural fear they can't control, but Dave's phobia bordered on the fringe of madness. He would go into hysteria even at the sight of a small field mouse. Perhaps he had a right to be afraid, after what happened that night. It was twilight when Dave left the small restaurant where he had eaten dinner, alone. The restaurant stood on one side of the large city park. And because it was a warm summer night, Dave decided to walk through the park to his apartment on the other side. He started down a path overhung by leafy trees. It was surprisingly dark on the path, dark enough to make Dave feel uneasy. He quickened his pace, thinking he should get to the other side of the park as soon as possible. He had heard stories about things, unpleasant things, that happened to people in the park at night. Then, coming out of the shaded path into an open area, he saw the sky was still light. He decided to walk a little slower, but he couldn't completely forget his uneasiness or the stories. He walked on through the park, toward the lake in the middle. Soon, another path loomed ahead, shaded by thick trees. Dave looked in the distance down the path. No one seemed to be on it. He looked behind him, wondering if he should turn around. By now, though, he had walked into the center of the park. There was no point in turning back. Once on the shaded path, he could hear no sounds but the rustle of leaves. The sounds of the city were drowned out here. Dave walked on, listening to the leaves whispering in the night air. He felt as though he were 1,000 miles from civilization. But then his ears picked up another sound. It wasn't a sound from the city outside, and it wasn't a sound from the trees either. He listened to his own footsteps on the cement path. He told himself that that was what he had heard. But no, he heard it again, an echo of his own footsteps behind him. He was sure of it now, there were other footsteps following him. Fear crept into his mind. It made his heart pound and his legs walk faster. Soon, Dave knew he had reason to be afraid. The footsteps behind were keeping pace with his, they had quickened with his own. He kept himself from running, knowing he must not show any fear, he knew he must stay in control of himself. Forcing his legs to slow down, he realized the footsteps behind him were not slowing down. They came up from behind, quickly. Dave couldn't control his fear any longer. He broke into a run down the path. The footsteps didn't follow right away. But then, over the pounding of his heart, he heard them hitting the pavement, fast and steady. Ahead, Dave saw the path that went down to the lake. He knew that people more often came to the lake than to any other place in the park. He ran down a small hill toward the lake. As he rounded a corner, his heart sank. The path by the lake was deserted, too. And now, the footsteps behind him were coming down the hill and were catching up with him. Dave looked around wildly. There was a dense area of bushes and trees to his left. He ran on a few steps and then threw himself into hiding in the bushes. Maybe, he prayed, the footsteps would go by. It was dark now. Only a half moon penetrated the night with its mellow light. Dave heard the footsteps first, then he saw the shadow that belonged to them. The man stopped walking 20 feet from where he was hiding. He stood silent for a minute with his back to him. Then he walked over to a bench at the lake's edge. He sat down on it. In the bushes, Dave sat sweating. He wondered why he had ever stopped running. Nothing could be worse than this. The man must know he was hiding. Was he going to wait it out until he couldn't stand to hide any longer? Then Dave thought of a chance. Others might walk along the path. He would jump out of the bushes then and walk with them out of the park. He looked over at the man on the bench again. He sat calmly looking out at the lake. Something caught his eye. There was a small shadow moving along the water's edge. It stopped. Silhouetted against the sky, Dave could see the head of a large rat. He started to get up off the ground. That was always his reaction to mice, to stand on a chair, to get up off the floor in any way possible. But now, he couldn't get up. And he couldn't let loose the scream choking in his throat. As in a bad nightmare, 3 more rats joined the one by the lake. Dave could see their fat shadows and their ugly rodent heads in the moonlight. And he could hear the clatter of their claws on the cement path. He wanted to scream, he wanted to run. But the bigger shadow on the bench scared him more. The man sat still on the bench, the rats not more than 5 feet away from him. He must see them, Dave thought. What kind of man is he? He switched his eyes back to the rats. They hypnotized him with loathing fear. He heard a rustle in the bushes, not more than 2 feet from him. He had to gag his mouth with his sweater to keep from screaming. What if a rat came up to him? What if it jumped on him with its sharp claws? Then, with horror, Dave saw that the 4 rats by the lake's edge were coming toward him. Their sharp rodent noses were pointing at him. Their long tails were switching back and forth. Dave screamed. He saw the shadow on the bench stand up. It started to come toward the bushes. Dave struggled to his feet. As he took a step backward, his foot fell into a deep hole. It was a rat's nest. Dozens of baby rats squealed in panic and crawled out of the hole around his foot. They were everywhere, scuttling away in desperation. Dave jerked his foot out of the hole. As he stepped back again, his foot landed on the soft body of a baby rat. It squealed in agony, and Dave screamed and screamed again. Then Dave saw the shadow of the man moving closer and closer to him. He struggled to get out of the bushes, although his knees were weak with fear. Finally, he pushed his way through the thick branches and stepped onto the path going back up the hill. The man had seen him. He came nearer. There, in the pale moonlight, Dave saw his face, and was filled with revulsion. It was the face of a huge rat, its whiskers twitching. Dave ran. Terror, mindless terror, carried him down the path out of the park. He did not hear footsteps following behind him. All he heard was the high, unnatural squeal of rats. Dave ran on until he finally escaped from the park. But as for the rat, Dave could never really escape from him. He will always be there in Dave's mind. The Corpse's Revenge. Henry Archer woke with a start, feeling as though he were coming out of a long nightmare. He remembered that he had been sick for weeks, deathly sick. He remembered the doctor standing over his bed and shaking his head, as though there were no hope. The faces of his nephews were there, too, their glittering eyes staring down at his weak body. At the time, Henry's confused thoughts had cleared enough to realize that they wanted him to die, wanted him dead so they could inherit all his money. Now Henry felt better than he had during all those long weeks of illness. The only problem he seemed to be having was a certain shortness of breath. And the night was so dark, and his bed felt unusually hard. Henry shifted his body, feeling how stiff and cold it seemed. Then he raised his hands, which were crossed over his chest, to stretch them. To his surprise, they hit a hard wooden board only several inches above his body. At first, Henry thought he must still be asleep and dreaming. He knew of no place like this that he'd ever been before. His hands groped around to feel what kind of place it was. The more he examined it, the more he came to realize that he was in some sort of wooden box. The air suddenly seemed heavier around him than before. Henry's mind raced through the possibilities. He could think of no other reason why he might be in a wooden box than if it were a coffin. Through the panic creeping into his brain, Henry remembered that if he were in a coffin, he would be dressed in his best clothes, not the night clothes of a sick man. With a sinking heart, he passed his hand over the smooth silk tie lying on his chest with his big diamond stick pin fastened through it. He remembered that he had written that request in his will, that he be buried with his diamond stick pin. Buried alive. Henry's mind sank into horror. The doctor must have thought him dead and buried him alive. He was not dead, but dead he would surely be in a few more hours. Henry pushed up his knees against the coffin lid. It didn't budge. He thought of the 6 feet of earth piled on top of him. Nothing he could do would move that weight. A scream of despair rose in Henry's throat and echoed off the walls of the coffin. He didn't know how he could endure the slow, horrible death that awaited him. And then, through the thoughts that tortured him, came a sound of something moving above him. It scratched against the dirt with sharp, steady movements. Every muscle in Henry's body tensed. What could be working through the ground of a graveyard with such persistence? Suddenly, Henry remembered horrible tales of graveyard rats. People said these rats were as big as cats. They dug down to freshly buried coffins. Then they chewed through the wood to get to the corpse inside. Henry shook with fear as the digging sound above him came closer and closer. He felt the air in the coffin become thicker and hotter. Now he had to face the choice of 2 terrible deaths. Suddenly, there was a dull scratch against the top of his coffin lid. Henry imagined how big a rat must be to make that sound. He tried to push up against the lid, but it was fastened tight. He would have to lie there, like a helpless victim, until the rats had gnawed through the lid. There was more scratching against the lid. Then, out of the darkness above him, Henry heard a voice. "We've almost got it now," the voice said. "All that's left is taking off the lid," a second voice added. Henry's body froze in shock. It wasn't rats that were after his body. It was grave robbers. He heard a crowbar being wedged under the coffin lid. Then, with a creak, it started to raise up. "You reach in for the diamond stick pin," the first voice said. "Uncle Henry paid thousands for it. It must be worth a fortune by now." "No use letting it sit on a corpse," the second said. Just then, the coffin lid worked loose. The 2 young men pulled off the lid and stared down at the corpse of their uncle. And as their greedy hands reached down to grab for his stick pin, Henry Archer rose out of his coffin and pulled them down into the grave. He left them there, screaming with terror. Then he walked back to town, brushing off the dirt that had fallen onto his diamond stick pin.